Guys, this is probably the last video that you're going to have to watch in this section of the lecture module, so you need to celebrate and rejoice because your work, on this section at least, is almost complete. So in the previous videos, we put a lot of focus on SDS, which stands for Safety Data Sheets. And we said that the reason we use SDS is it's really our first line of defense. Okay, if we have to use a chemical in a laboratory, the SDS sheet is going to contain all the information that I need for that particular chemical. It will tell me the health hazards, it will tell me how I dispose of it, it will tell me where I need to store it and how to handle it. So, first line of defense, of course, includes my PPE that I should wear when I use this chemical in a laboratory. It tells me a little bit about how it will react, maybe with some other chemicals in the laboratory, if I need to pay special attention to those reactions. And then finally, what would happen if I spill it? So we know it's going to happen. We know that, no matter how careful I can be in a laboratory, something at some point in time is probably going to spill on the countertop or in the floor. So the SDS would give me a little bit of insight about how to clean up that spill, whether it's a solid or liquid or even a gas. We also said that the SDS has a tendency to overstate hazards. We saw that in a way with the water SDS that we covered in the previous video. So yes, it's in there. Yes, they make these full-blown statements. I know that I should wear safety goggles and a lab coat when I use water, but does that really make sense? And the answer is no, not really. But how do I know, if I've never worked with that chemical before, what is overstated and what is not? And the answer is you don't. So you're just going to have to use your own experience working with that chemical to figure out whether or not these are exaggerated statements. But they are in there in somewhat for a legal reason. Now, we know that the SDS sheets are not legal documents. We know that these sheets cannot be upheld in a court of law, but they try to be as prim and proper as they can. And if they put in a disclaimer, or if they put in a clause or a statement in the SDS sheet, they want you to understand it's not 100% accurate. What a lot of people forget to realize, though, is that statements that are made in the SDS sheets or in the SDS document, they are not really meant for you. Okay? Now, I know that you are working with those chemicals and you are in a laboratory and you're probably using very small scale amounts of the chemical. But the SDS, when they were written and when they were formulated, really was intended for large industry. So we're not talking about a couple of milliliters of stuff in a laboratory. We're talking about gallons and liters and vats of this chemical that's out there in a industrial setting or an industrial lab event. That maybe could something could happen to it. It could be mishandled. It could go under some type of reaction. But that's really the intention. It's large industry scale, not laboratory scale most of the time. So there's always a question. What are the real concerns? And we don't really know. The only way that you can do this is with experience working with the chemical and with time. So you're going to have to kind of get acquainted with that chemical. You're going to have to establish a relationship with it before you really know how careful that you have to handle this chemical that you're bringing into a lab. We also saw that these statements can be very general, and that's really design, by design at least. because they do not want to be specific unless they absolutely have to be specific. So, for instance, it would say the SDS, you need to wear gloves when handling the chemical, but they don't really tell you what type of gloves that you should be wearing. They will let you figure that out and let you make that judgment on your own. Or it will say clean up a spill, but they don't really tell you with what. So, for example, in the SDS that we talked about in the previous video with water, it basically told us to clean up the spill with an inert material. Well, it never really did tell you what type of material to clean that up with. So they're going to let you make that assumption and let you make that decision. That way, if something happens and you've used the wrong one because it was the decision that you made, well, you can't blame that on the company that provided the SDS, now can you? So that's why we often saw in that SDS follow state and local protocols. They want you to kind of refer to other people and not put the blame directly on them. All right. So SDSs are great. However, SDSs, you need to understand, are not reliable, are not 100% accurate. They are not legal documents. It's just really a source of information for you, and that's basically it. So this leads us to our ramp, and you know as good as well as I do, every time we put this up on the screen, that means we're getting closer to the end of this portion of the lecture module, and we are. So this is going to be the kind of the last note slide that you're going to be taking for this section. So R is, of course, recognize. So what do we want to recognize? We want to recognize the hazards of chemicals, and we now kind of know where to find that. So assess the level of risk posed by the chemical. Again, we know where to find that as well. That's all in the SDS sheets that are available to me very easily off of the internet or in a laboratory environment. M is minimize, right? Well, what do we want to minimize? We want to minimize the risk. And the way that we minimize the risk is to know the hazards and use PPE. So personal protective equipment, and we want to lower the exposure whenever necessary. If we lower the exposure, we don't have to worry about it getting on our skin or in our eyes or in our mouth or for us to breathe in it. And it makes everybody much happier in a laboratory. And finally, prepare. Well, what do we want to prepare for? We want to prepare for the emergencies that can happen based on the hazards that are associated with the chemical. Meaning that if we're using a chemical in a laboratory and we've done our duty and we've looked up the SDS and we understand what could possibly happen with this chemical, well, we need to be ready for if that does happen. So if it says there's a possible flammability charge and we go into a laboratory and this sucker catches on fire, then we need to make sure that we are ready for that to happen and we know how to handle that emergency if it does happen. That way we can completely extinguish the fire, extinguish the problem, and not worry about any of these harming other employees or other students or the laboratory itself. So that really sums up this portion of the lecture module. Again, you're probably ready for the assignment now. Review your notes, make sure that you fully understand everything that we've talked about in this section of the course, and make another 100 on that assessment. So as long as you keep cranking those out, you'll end up with an A at the very end of this process. So once you get finished with that assessment, we'll come back, we'll start the next portion of this lecture module, and we'll continue working through these exposures.